All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Tattooed Preacher Podcast. This is episode number 56. Hope you are all doing awesome today. On this episode, going to be looking at a few different things. Number one, going to be talking polygamy. Is God cool with polygamy? Does the Bible condone polygamy? Apparently, it's a trending, controversial topic, especially in the Christian world. So I'm gonna weigh in, share my thoughts on this issue. And to be honest, I don't know why it's controversial, but I'm gonna chat about that. Secondly, we're gonna talk about, I don't know how to actually title it, but the harsh words of Jesus when we're actually preaching the gospel and we're actually talking about who Jesus is and what he's done. What kind of reaction should that elicit? And we're going to look at some instances in the text when people were confronted with the reality that Jesus is either crazy or he's God. It's one or the other. So we're going to talk about that. And then thirdly, came across this video of this ceremony where this Catholic church had some kind of ceremony that they were honoring Mary. And I watched it and I'm like, man, like this is just utter idolatry. And so we're going to look at that video and just talk about the idolatry of it and how, venerating Mary or other biblical figures is idolatry. So gonna conclude the episode talking about that. So that's where we're going in this video. Hope those interest you. And yeah, so sit back, relax, and enjoy episode 56. All right, so firstly, polygamy. Now, I've recently seen a lot of stuff on social media, videos, blogs, people just creating content surrounding this whole subject. And so for those of you who don't know what polygamy is, it's the practice of where one dude has multiple wives, multiple marriage partners. And I mean, this practice has been going on for thousands of years. It's nothing new. But I guess recently there's a small minority of the population that is, I guess, re-engaging with this ancient practice. And there are a lot of people who are out there now promoting this as a Christian lifestyle. And so it's causing some confusion and, it's a hotly trending topic. And so I keep seeing stuff about it. So I thought, okay, let's weigh in on this issue because, to be honest, I don't understand how it's an issue. I don't know how you can honestly and faithfully read the Bible and come to the conclusion that either the answer is unambiguous or that God would actually be cool with this lifestyle. And so there's a lot of quote unquote Christians out there saying, well, the Bible condones it. It's clear in the scriptures that God is cool with it. So let's ask the question. Let's look at it for ourselves here. Is God cool with polygamy? Does the Bible condone polygamy? This practice, this lifestyle. Is it okay for a modern day Christian or a Christian of any time partaking in this kind of lifestyle? So the first thing I want to say about this is when we're studying the Bible, I don't understand why we can't, or why we read the Bible and just because the Bible highlights a particular lifestyle, behavior, action of a person, then we automatically just assume, well, then God must condone it. Like if it's written in the Bible, then God clearly must condone this behavior. Like I don't understand how we get to that how we get to that hermeneutic, how we get to that biblical interpretation. Because people will say, well, let's look at Abraham. He had Sarah's wife, and he also had a concubine. His son Jacob, 2 wives. You look at King David, multiple wives. You look at the classic example, Solomon, hundreds of wives and hundreds of concubines. And so people will look at that and say, well, see, God, David was a man after God's own heart. Solomon was the wisest man that ever lived. Abraham is like the father of the faith. Jacob literally became Israel. So it's like you have these prominent biblical figures engaging in this kind of lifestyle. So clearly, God must be cool with it. They did it in the Old Testament. So why can't we do it today? And this whole perspective of like, well, the Bible talked about it, so God must be cool with it. It's just, I don't get how someone can honestly and faithfully read the Bible using that metric for interpretation. Because if we're honest, like let's just think logically here. If you want to go down that road, the Bible talks about a lot of things, horrific things that God clearly doesn't condone that people do. One that comes to mind is David and Bathsheba. David should have been out to war, didn't go with his men. He's at home, walking around the top of his little castle area, looks down, sees a woman bathing. He's like, I want her. Goes and has her brought to him and basically forces her to be with him. And then, of course, has her husband unalived and gets her pregnant. And now, does God, the Bible, like records this story? Are we going to say that God's okay with that? Did God condone David for doing that? Well, clearly not. And God harshly judges David for that choice. So that's one example of literally hundreds of examples where people are doing things in the text. People are doing things that God's not okay with. So deciding to come up with this idea where, well, hey, Abraham did it, Jacob did it, David did it, Solomon did it. So if they can do it, then why can't I do it today? So here's my pushback. What does Jesus say about it? Because ultimately everything is about Christ. And when you're reading the New Testament and you're reading about the life of Jesus and what he says and what he taught and what he believes, Jesus is like the main interpretive tool, if I can use that word, of how we should look at the Old Testament. Because Jesus takes a lot of the Old Testament teachings and repurposes them, or elevates their meaning, or elevates their significance. I mean, look at the Sermon on the Mount. He quotes the Old Testament law, but then elevates it. And so what does he say about marriage? Well, firstly, he says that marriage is between one man and one woman forever. That's marriage. One man, one woman forever, point blank. He says nothing about multiple marital partners. In fact, he quotes Genesis, where a man shall leave his father and his mother to be united to his wife and to become one. Doesn't leave that open-ended to leave their mother and father for multiple women. That's nowhere in the Bible. So it's clear Jesus taught one man, one woman forever. When you read Paul, how does he talk about marriage? Talks about how marriage is a picture of the relationship between Christ and the church. How it's this covenant. Christ is the groom, the church is the bride. We see all throughout the epistles, that the church is the bride of Christ. He's the bridegroom, we are the bride. and how marriage is this picture of this covenant Christ has with his church. Now, does it say anywhere that Jesus has multiple wives? We're his bride, the church is the bride. Does he leave it open for having other brides in there? No, it's not the picture. I mean, this is not rocket science. I mean, some of you may be listening and are like, what do you like? This is obvious stuff. Yeah, I know it's obvious, but apparently some people are extremely confused by it or just don't want to believe it. But we see that marriage is a picture of Christ's relationship with his church. It's this picture of this covenant between just Christ and just his church. Bride, groom, that's it. No multiple brides, no multiple grooms. And so it's very clear when you read Jesus and the things that he said, or the things that are said about him in the scriptures that are revealed. Marriage is one man, one woman, forever, as pictured in the imagery of Christ being related to his church. So to me, it's not a controversial issue. It's very clear. And if you hear that and you're still going, well, you know what? It's still, the Old Testament talks about it. Like that argument, like at that point, you're just looking for a reason to do it. And you're trying to use the Bible to justify it. Taking verses out of context, trying to make it mean things that it doesn't mean. And if that's you at that point, I mean, you don't know how to read the Bible and you're just using it to fulfill your sinful desires, because God does not condone polygamy. And so I think that is all I want to say on that. Yeah, here we go. Moving on. Okay, so the next thing I want to just hit on is this whole idea of the harsh words of Jesus. And I got this topic. I was reading through the Gospel of John recently. And all throughout this book, you see these settings where Jesus is speaking to the disciples or speaking to the Pharisees, like the religious leaders, or he's speaking to the crowds, large gatherings of people. And you often see this play out where he's talking about stuff, and then at the end, it rubs people the wrong way. Like it's forcing people to either accept what he says or reject. Like there's no middle ground. And I think John highlights this tension more than any of the other gospels. You know, we have in John 6, for example, where he's speaking to the crowd, and this is long discourse, and where he's like saying things like, if you don't drink my blood and eat my flesh, like you can't follow me. And I mean, to us, that just sounds disgusting, but to a first century Jew, that's utterly offensive. And so at the end of like that whole discourse and that whole conversation he was having, it said there were all these disciples that were following Jesus end up turning around and walking away because they couldn't handle it. They were like, man, like this is harsh. Jesus, the things you're saying are harsh. And so ultimately, all these people, hundreds of his disciples, walk away. And so then Jesus goes to his 12. He's like, are you guys going to go too? And then this is where Peter says, where else are we going to go? Like, there's nowhere else to go. So we have to accept what you're saying, basically, is what Peter was getting at. And so you have the situation where Jesus is speaking and people are left facing this moment of decision. It's like, wow, the stuff that he's saying, this is hard. This is harsh. This is offensive. I don't like it. It's making me feel uncomfortable, poking at me. And it caused them to make this choice of like, am I going to continue following Jesus, or am I going to be like, I can't do it anymore, and walking away? It forced them to make this decision. And then in John chapter 10, we see it happen again, where this is where Jesus talks about how he's the door, and he talks about how he's the good shepherd, and how he's not a hired hand. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, and my sheep know my voice, and goes through um this famous message. But then in verse 19 of John 10, we read this. It says, dissension occurred again among the Jews because of these words. And dissension occurred again. And many of them were saying he has a demon and is insane. But then others were saying, these are not the words of someone who's demon possessed, because a demon cannot open the eyes of the blind. So again, Jesus has this whole conversation and people are left. This dissension broke out amongst the crowd, and you have people saying he's either an insane demon possessed person, he's crazy, or in fact, he's God. It's like one or the other. And John highlights this tension, um, especially in his gospel account, I think more than the others, as I mentioned. And it just got me thinking about like the current church. And when you hear or when you see, I guess, a lot of the more famous, more popular preachers, pastors, Christian leaders out there who have their stuff on global uh, a global platform where you have millions of people seeing them, hearing them, and all that. And when you hear them talk about Jesus, and it's like, do we really see this tension today in the church? Where it's like when people hear the gospel and they hear pastors talk about who Jesus is, what he's done, are people left with that same kind of decision to make where it's like, well, he's either a crazy demon possessed insane person or he's God. Because I think that the pull is to make the gospel, make talking about Jesus more palatable. And yeah, I do think there's multiple ways and creative ways where you can present the gospel message and all that. But at the heart, at the foundation of it, there's no middle ground. There's no like creating this narrative where Jesus is just this nice, soft, gentle dude who's just this all loving, and we kind of have created this nice Jesus because we don't want to offend people. We are so afraid of offending people in our modern world just because of how our society's gone with censorship and this trying to preach inclusivity, where truth is subjective to the person, and you can't step on anyone's toes, and you have to accept everybody just the way they are, no matter what they say, think, or believe. And we're so afraid of offending people, so we have to create our messages. And when we talk about the Bible, we talk about Jesus, we have to say it in such a way that's just not offensive, non-invasive, where people are willing to sit and listen and not be offended. And we're so afraid of that. And it's like Jesus did not care about that. And you see how, especially John, has put his gospel together. He didn't care about his original hearers, first century church who was listening to this or not listening, or reading it or hearing it, that at the end they're going to feel offended. Jesus didn't care. He's having this massive conversation with this large crowd. He did not care at the end that hundreds of them are walking away. He still said what needed to be said. He wasn't afraid to offend people. Dissension occurred again among the Jews because of these words. Jesus is point blank saying, I'm the good shepherd. I'm the light of the world. I'm the door. I am. That phrase there, he's referencing when Yahweh in the Old Testament said to Moses, when Moses is asking God, okay, well, who do I say is sending me to Pharaoh? And God says, well, tell Pharaoh, I am sending you. Just as what Jesus is, he's making himself God here. He's equating himself with God. And people say, how come Jesus doesn't declare that he's God? Well, that's how he did it here. So he's not afraid, point blank, saying, I'm the door, I'm the good shepherd, I'm the light of the world, I am. And dissension occurred among the Jews because of these words where people were saying, dude's either demon-possessed and is insane, or he actually is God. Like, that's the choice. And I look at our church and it's like people who've never heard the gospel, who've never heard, preaching about Jesus, I don't see them being confronted with that reality where the truth of who Jesus is and what he's done is being preached unfiltered, not trying to dress it up in such a way as to not offend people, but like actually being preached with no fear. And then at the end, letting people decide what they're going to think about it. If people get offended, get angry, they get up and walk out, so be it. But at least the truth was preached. Now, yes, you preach in love. I'm not saying you yell. It's not about yelling and screaming and being condemning. It's just not filtering the truth. When it says Jesus is the only way, you can say that in love. You're communicating, but it's communicating the truth. There is only one way. It's not multiple roads. Jesus is the door. Jesus is the good shepherd. Jesus is the I am. Jesus is God. Salvation comes only through him. You can say that in a loving way, but you can still communicate that, and that's the truth. And that's going to create conflict in people's, especially when it's weighed against the culture in which we live in. And so it says dissension occurred because of these words. And it's like people were forced to make a choice about Jesus. They were confronted with his words. And my prayer is that we would get back to that, where we wouldn't care about numbers. We would care about the truth being proclaimed and preached, and people forced to make a choice. And some, like, there's no pressure on us because it's like Jesus himself walked the earth, performed countless miracles, signs and wonders, spoke in a way that no one else had ever spoken before. I mean, you see that all throughout the Gospels. He spoke as one with authority, that they've never heard someone speak this way. Had all these massive outdoor crusades, and yet people still walked away from him and ultimately killed him. And that's God himself was saying those words, preaching those words, performing these signs, wonders, and miracles. And it was God himself in the flesh, and people still rejected it. So there's no pressure on us as Christians trying to make people believe. It's not our job. Jesus himself couldn't make everyone believe. And he's God. He simply communicated the truth and gave them a choice, either accept or reject. And so I pray that we get back to that kind of communication, this communicating of the truth, were people, even Christians, because in John 6, they were his disciples that were walking away. It wasn't just the non-believers. I'm sure some non-believers were in that crowd who were just there to witness the miracles. But the disciples themselves, and I think there's a lot of Christians in church, Christians, and I say that in quotes, in church, who have never really heard the true gospel communicated in such a way that would cause them to make that choice. Because I think if the true gospel is communicated and that tension is created, you're going to see how many real Christians are in your churches or fake ones, because the fake ones will ultimately walk away. And so it's not just for unbelievers. It's for people who've gone to church for years, but their faith, man, is very shallow and borderline unlegit. So this is why it's important to communicate the true gospel of who Jesus is and what he's done. And finally, last thing I want to hit on, and I've addressed this topic a few different times, but it seems like more and more I'm just seeing more evidence of this reality when it comes to the Catholic Church, and I feel like I got to weigh in again. And the more I am, the more I confront and am confronted with Catholicism, the more that I see it as this idolatrous religion. Now, I'm not saying every Catholic out there, because there's what, I don't know, 1 billion, or I don't know the stats, insane amount of numbers that claim to be Catholic. And I think there's a lot of Catholics that legitimately love Jesus, believe in the gospel, and who don't necessarily participate in a lot of this, I would say, pagan practice that happens. But the more that I see it, man, it's like there are some massive, massive red flags when it comes to Catholicism. And I see these ceremonies, these rituals that are done, and it screams idolatry. It screams idolatry. So I came across this video, and I'm going to play it. So for those of you who are watching this on YouTube, you're going to see the video. For those of you who are listening, it's about a minute and a half video. Then I'm going to explain it so at least you can know what you're hearing, or you can just skip the next 90 seconds. But basically came across this video of this ceremony that was happening in this big Catholic church, and where I guess there's a bunch of these dudes and they're carrying this massive statue of Mary down the middle aisle through the church. Music is playing, and it's like, and then they take her to the front, and then they put something on her head, and it's this whole veneration ceremony ritual thing, and that's basically what's going on. But it's like, I don't know how you watch that and not come to the conclusion that this is idolatry. Like you're in a church, you're in a service, and the main reason why you go to church is to worship Jesus. That's the only being, that's the only person that needs to be venerated or worshiped. God. All throughout the Bible, God says, what's the first commandment? You shall have no other gods before me. We should only be worshiping him. But yet you have this procession taking place, this ceremony where they're venerating Mary again. Why? I get she was Jesus's mom. Awesome. That doesn't mean she needs to be worshipped. Doesn't mean that doesn't mean she needs to be put on this throne, carried down through a church, and then have this whole ceremony done unto her. It's just like, this is idolatry. This is pagan idolatry, satanic practice. So here's the video. Check it out, and then we'll chat some more. So they're coming down the aisle. Dude, there's one dude's leading the way, offering up incense. And then behind him, there's a bunch of these other dudes carrying this massive statue. Oh, I think it's Mary. Huge church. Now they got to the front, and she's up on this table or throne thing, and they're placing something, crown or something on her head. And now the whole place is applauding. Like this is... So again, I don't know how you can watch that and not think that that's idolatry. Like I can't imagine going to any other church. I grew up Pentecostal, charismatic, and I can't imagine going to a Pentecostal church and in the midst of the service, everything stops and, down the aisle is a statue of someone. I mean, like God even said, don't even create a statue of me to worship. This is why God was so mad at them, at Israel, for creating the golden calf. A lot of commentators and scholars think that they weren't necessarily worshiping the golden calf in and of itself, but to them, that was they were worshiping, they were in their heads, that was God. Like they had associated God, Yahweh, with the golden calf. And there's a lot of reasons for that. That's not the point of this episode. And God said, don't create even an image of me. So I can imagine being in a Pentecostal service and down comes this massive statue where you have people offering incense, smoke to this statue. Like this is idolatry. If we're not even create an image of God, how is it creating an image of a human? Doesn't matter if it's the mother of Jesus or not. How is that not false worship? It's just in God's space. It's the house of God. And you are offering worship to someone other than God. I don't get it. I mean, the more I look into Catholicism, the more it's idolatry. This pagan idolatry. And you have, over 1 billion people, 2 billion, I don't know the number. And again, not every single Catholic, I guess, would participate in this, but there's a lot that would and a lot that do. And it's like they are ushering in false worship, and all these people are just paying attention. And they are involving themselves in it. They're all participating in it. I look at that video and it's just a massive group of people worshiping an idol. And so it's just like it's dangerous. It's dangerous. It's demonic. And it's like yeah. So I really don't know like what to say other than, guys, you can't worship idols. Like it seems like a very biblical thing to say, because idol worship was a massive biblical occurrence. We don't really think of modern day worshiping idols. When we think of worshiping idols in our modern day, it's like the idol of money or the idol of success, and we use them as metaphors, not actually worshiping objects. But this is what this is. This is like you can't worship objects. And millions upon millions of people are doing it. God is not cool with that. He's not cool with that. So if you're part of a church that does this, you need to leave the church. This is idolatry. It's false worship. And you are headed down a very dangerous path. It's idolatry. So that's what I wanted to say. Yeah, those are the three things wanted to hit on in this episode. Thanks so much for listening and or watching. Feel free to follow me, social media, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube if you're listening to this. Same handle, @The Tattooed Preacher. Links to all of them will be in the description below or in the show notes. Yeah, have yourself an awesome rest of your day or evening, and we'll see you all in the next episode. Much love. God bless.